ongoing thing, but especially in the past year, been dealing with a lot of trauma. I think one of the first times you came, I hate to have my back to anyone. And the first times you came, I think we had a young suicide in the community, Katrina's son. But I'm just talking to her for now, and I'll thanks. So the idea is that we've had a lot of exceptional crisis and turmoil in the past year, and that is Caitlin's specialty. So she's been of support to me personally, support to the community, support to your community in Colorado. And I was amazed the first time that I talked to her how calm she was about things that terrify me. And so that's really soothing. And over the past year or two or three, I've gotten to know you better. And I find her absolutely fascinating. So I invited her to do a class on emotional hygiene in times of crisis. And this is kind of like the sneak preview, because we're going to have it up on our educational learning platform so that it's accessible to everybody. And we're going to, do the whole slideshow presentation. But you guys are getting a really special sneak peek. And it's a toolkit, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So I'm going to step back and let you take over. So happy?
Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, just to add on to that, it's a work in progress. And so part of what I want to do today is hear a little bit from you guys about what emotional hygiene means. And so I'm going to dig in and start talking about some stuff. And then I want you guys to feel free to raise your hand, ask questions, talk about stuff, because this is such a nuanced and complex, set of ideas and conversation that I want us to be able to talk about it and have a dialogue about it, and just know that it's different for everyone. And I do believe in meeting people where they are, which means that you're allowing them to have their experience, and in that moment, you're not judging them. You're just sort of holding space, like June talked about, being a reflection, letting that person have their experience, and understanding that everyone is different. And so everyone is absorbing and taking in information differently. They're making different stories in their head. They're making sense of things in different ways. And so we honor all those experiences, and yeah, you're free to jump in. So I'll just start off and introduce myself a little bit more. As most of you know, my name is Caitlin. I'm a social worker on a mobile crisis unit in southwestern Colorado. We cover the sort of bottom southwestern 5 counties, and so and we cover a pretty rural range as well. And so that means sometimes I'm in cities responding with law enforcement, and sometimes I'm hiking to someone's cabin through knee-high snow at 11,000 feet. Because that's the community I serve, and I love that, and I love my community, and it's really diverse. I got my master's at a very small cohort in Durango, Colorado, that was based around Native American studies and history. And it's kind of a shame that I had to go to grad school in order to get that learning and education about, just the history of our country. And I'm also so happy that I got that and got that experience, because it really helps me serve my community better. The first step to being able to be supportive to someone is having some more insight and awareness into them, whatever that means. And so whether that's culturally or historically, or that's you asking them to share a little bit about, where they're coming from. It can be many things. And a lot of it is just I find my responsibility to go educate myself on, and so sometimes it's taxing to ask someone, what was that like for you to have parents who were sent to boarding schools and to have their identity wiped away, so if I can do my part and be doing research on my end or education on my end, and without re-traumatizing, or without, I guess re-traumatizing is a good way of putting it, then I'm doing that. And so, so on a mobile crisis team, we do, every day is totally different, predictable, and sometimes it means that I'm doing psych assessments on people to figure out what the next appropriate step is. Sometimes it means I'm talking to people over the phone. I respond with law enforcement a lot. I love it when law enforcement call me, because that means that they are out of their scope and they're looking for input and they're looking to give people the best possible outcome, you know? And so I love it when somebody can say like, oh, this isn't really my field, I'm gonna bring in somebody whose field is, you know, instead of trying to be that person to like make these assessments or judgments. And so I appreciate when anyone does that. And you know, if you ask me a question and I don't know, I'm gonna tell you I don't know, and we can talk about it, you know, and so I say that a lot to people. I'll say something along the lines of like, I'm gonna go like staff this with my team a little bit and come back to you if I don't know. I'm not just gonna make something up or take a guess, shot in the dark, you know. So that's a little bit about what I do. And yeah, I'd like to start and just touch briefly on the brain and the incredible organism that our brains are. I think Tom Robbins said like the brain is an educational toy. It is. And I mean, what we're finding out about neuroscience is that it is flexible, it is resilient, it can heal beyond the powers that we know or understand. We're constantly finding new things out about our brain and about how it's connected to our hearts, even on a physiological level, that we, you know, pretty recently discovered that we have something running from the brain to the heart that we didn't even realize, you know. And it's an incredible, the whole body is an incredible system, but the brain is really amazing because it's like a piece of software that's constantly reinventing itself. Every conversation you have with someone, every experience, your brain is changing just a little bit and creating new neural pathways. The brain never stands still. And so I think part of emotional hygiene in times of crisis and part of like getting grounded in times of crisis is just having the insight of how your brain is processing its environment, its experiences. Everyone's perception is different. Like, it's really fun to think about, we don't know what reality really is until we get together in a group and we're like, did you see that? I saw that. Well, I saw this. And we don't really have a good barometer for judging what reality is because each person's perception is different. Each person has their own unique history and childhood. They have their own unique dreams at night. You know, they have their own unique system and perception. And I think learning how you can sort of fine-tune that and support that is really important. A lot of you probably know that the back of our brain is the most archaic. That's like the survival or the reptilian brain, the lizard brain. And that really is like survival, you know? And a lot of times that comes down to like fear, trauma responses, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, which is a new one we've kind of been putting in there, is fawn. And that's when you're like, can I take care of this for you? Can I take care of you? You know, and like pleasing and doing so in a way that's like based on survival, which is really big. And so the front of your brain is really the most, like the newest part, and it's often the part that we refer to as like being a home for our consciousness and like higher levels of consciousness, spirituality, creativity. And so the really interesting thing I think about your brain is that the different parts of it need different nutrients. And so your reptilian brainstem back here, the survival one, all it needs is junk food. Like it could survive on Cheetos forever. Like it's fine. But the front of your brain, in order to be functioning and to be like, you know, functioning really well and engaged with your whole psyche and body and the rest of your brain, it needs healthy fats and healthy proteins. And another interesting thing is that when we're stressed out, when we're really living in that like trauma response, then the back of your brain will hijack those nutrients from the front of your brain because it's stressed out and it's like, I need everything. And so it will hijack that, and that's like a survival thing. And so it's not just about taking in like the nutrients that we need. It's also about like, can I be grounded enough and rooted enough, especially in times of crisis? Can I carry that calm? Can I not panic? You know, that's the biggest thing. And time of crisis is like the first thing is don't panic. You're back in the back of your brain. And if you are back in this limbic part of your brain, then you're not living freely. You're not making decisions from a conscious, you're not making decisions from where you want to make decisions from, which is a really conscious, collected, engaged space where you can like receive all the information, be reading your environment in a way that's like pretty accurate, you know. And so you want to be more up here rather than back here. Another interesting point I think about the brain is and how we process our experiences. And so trauma will often get stuck right in the center of our brain in the hippocampus. And so the hippocampus is also where your short-term memory lives. And so that kind of says a lot for like, okay, well, trauma is living in the same place where your short-term memory is. That's why I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with like, when you get triggered by trauma, it comes back like it's right here. It comes back like it is in your short-term memory is because it is. And that's the unprocessed bits of trauma, you know? And so it's interesting because it kind of like gets stuck in our brain the way like a piece of paper goes through a copy machine and then gets stuck and can't process fully through the other parts of the machine. And so, you know, somatic experiencing. And that's a form of like, that's a form of therapy, and that is all about making sure our experiences and our traumas get cycled all the way through, which means going through that experience. And a good way to like depict that is with wild animals. When wild animals are threatened with death in the wild, say you're a zebra and you are, you know, almost killed by a lion, but you survive narrowly, that animal takes off, it runs for 5 seconds, maybe it goes to the bathroom, it shakes its whole body, and then it shakes its whole body off. And that's kind of like a somatic reset, you know? And so what's interesting about wild animals is they don't carry trauma. And so it's really interesting because our pets do. You know, we've all seen animals, domesticated animals that are carrying trauma, right? And so I think that is fascinating, and that says a lot. And somatic experiencing is all about stretching your emotional rubber bands out little by little and feeling those emotions coming back into the safe space. Feeling those emotions, not breaking, but bending, and then coming back into that safe space. And so, yeah, so that's a little bit about the brain and just a little bit about how trauma can get stuck in our brain. And I guess it would be good to also say here some of the things that can really help us to move trauma through are things, especially bilateral things. And bilateral means going from like right to left. And so EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing, is a bilateral form of therapy. The therapist either uses a and goes like that, and you follow that, and that's a bilateral. The woman who came up with this, she discovered that like she would be struggling internally with something, and she would go for a walk and kind of mull it over, but really just like be in the space of the walk, and that something would shift. Hands down, it would shift. And she came to realize it was that bilateral, right to left. I think that's wonderful because that's something we all do every day is walk, you know, not all of us, I should say, but it's accessible even if you don't walk. There are so many ways to stimulate your brain bilaterally. And so Eleanor is going to show us one of those later tonight, hopefully, but Yoga Nidra, I bring that up to my clients all the time. Yoga Nidra is great for helping you to drop into a deeper state of rest and also does a similar thing to EMDR, where it's like you're going back and forth between the right and left hemispheres of your brain, and then at a certain point, there's a connection and they both light up at the same time. And that's such a powerful place to be in, and that's when we really want to go in and put in those like positive intentions or those messages that our brain and psyche and our bodies need to hear. That can be really, and so that's certainly not the bilateral movement is not the only way to process trauma, but I really like that because research is showing that it's, you know, it's one of the most powerful forms of trauma therapy and like trauma reprocessing, and it's also one of the people. Before we had EMDR, we had re-experiencing, or, you know, which is where we send people out to experience the trauma again, you know. If, say, we had a military member who really doesn't want to go into the store when it's busy because they don't want to be in a crowded place, you know, exposure therapy is, you know, supporting them but sending them into the store, and it shows that it's effective for about 50% of people, which means that it's really traumatizing and like really damaging for about 50% of people, which are not odds that I like, you know. It's not to say that either. I think that any form of therapy can be traumatizing if it's not appropriate and if it's not supportive, you know. And so that's something else I think is really important to touch on, is that, you know, I'm in the mental health field and I think that it really needs to shift. I think that there are changes that do need to be made because it's not accessible for everyone to pay $150 sometimes a week to see a therapist. Part of therapy is figuring out if you like your therapist. If you don't like your therapist, you need to find a new therapist. That connection is the most important piece of it. That trust, that you're talking to someone who you trust and who you just feel on a level has your best interests at heart, is so important. And that's truly meeting someone where they are, you know, with non-judgment. And sometimes a therapist can't do that, and then it's their responsibility to say, you know, I have a referral for you, you know, or to have that conversation. But that's the most important piece. And so I think that for me, especially being in this community, it's so important that we're learning how to support each other. And I'm not saying that we don't ever need a therapist, or that like some things, it's really important that you have a mental professional probably involved. That is very true as well. But in so many ways, we can be acting as peer support for one another, which means practicing reflective listening, showing up, holding space with loving kindness and compassion and non-judgment, and that we can teach each other to do that, you know, and that also our society maybe hasn't done a great job of teaching us how to show up for our friends, our peers in that way, you know, but it's so vital for a community that we know what active listening looks and feels like, you know, that we know what support looks like. And so, yeah. So emotional hygiene, what does that mean? Does anybody have anything that like jumps out at them when I say emotional hygiene?
The importance of the breath. When you see people experiencing manic episodes, they're obviously low on oxygen, and obviously all these healing arts are very focused on the breath, and yoga is understanding when to go in, when to go out, and how to make, you know, get yourself in a good center position.
That's so true. It's so true. Breath is life, and I really equate that with, you know, when I think again about being back in the limbic part of your brain and that old part of your brain, that's about constriction, you know, and when we constrict, we stop breathing, and nothing really good comes from that, you know. Everything moving forward comes from openness. It comes from the breath, and that means breathing into that openness, that allowing, you know. That doesn't mean that we allow everything because we accept everything. Sometimes we allow and accept ourselves to say no, you know? That's practicing just as much radical acceptance, you know, of your own boundaries or whatever it is. But yeah, I love that.
I go and I eat some garlic hummus, and I need to go brush my teeth, you know, because it's like hygiene. I can
Yeah.
smell it in my breath, and I smell like garlic, and
Yeah.
I flick you my garlic breath if I'm giving you a massage.
Yeah.
And so just in the same way, when you have tough emotional experiences, or someone yells at you, or, you know, something difficult
Yeah.
happens in the world, emotional hygiene can look like recognizing that. It's not always easy to do, to be like, hey, I need to stop. I need to remove myself from this situation. I need to go take a nap, do yoga nidra, sit quietly by myself, whatever it is, whatever that looks like for you. That's what I think of.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I think that it's just as important that we're doing that for ourselves as when we get sick and we need to like go to the doctor, or when our car breaks down and we have to go to the mechanic. We're often forced to do these other things, and I think that we need to make it just as important to be checking in on a regular basis with our emotional state, you know, and our psyche. Just as important as any of the other checkups that you do. And we don't really do that, and we don't really have a good system or program or protocol for doing that and checking in with like, gosh, where am I at? And also, where's my sleep levels at? When did I eat last? What have I been putting into my body? What have I been looking at? What have I been listening to? You know, all these things are feeding us. Yeah.
I have some pretty extreme trauma in the physical realm, and mental, emotional as well, but the physical is what I've stayed in my
Yeah.
body my whole life.
Yeah.
So I do some pretty extreme practices around this. One is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and one is Shibari, where I utilize consent to almost get myself in re-traumatizing situations where I have all the power.
Yeah.
And so in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, people will choke you.
Yeah.
People will try to break your bones and pull your limbs from your body. And as soon as you tap, they stop.
Yeah.
You have all the power to say, this is too far.
Absolutely.
And so I get myself in these practices because it's very much embodying. I can't think of anything else except for what I'm doing right then and there, and it helps me be in my body instead of thinking
Yeah.
and reprocessing and
Yeah.
creating. And that's kind of something that
I love that, and I love that idea because so often people are, when they're traumatized, especially physically, they're not allowed to make those movements in that trauma, right? And so they're confined, they're restrained, you know, their boundaries are crossed. And so when you, and so like that kind of therapy is so incredible because it's allowing people to make the movements that they weren't allowed to make when they were in the midst of that trauma, and that's so healing. And I think that goes back to somatic experiencing of completing the wheel. With trauma especially, and probably with, so there's like big trauma, there's complex trauma where it all piles up one on top of another, and so your psyche can't get a chance to process because it's just another trauma, and then you're under the weight of all of them. And then there's, what was I saying? There's complex trauma, and yeah, and so we get stuck, and then there's traumatic stress, which we all have little pieces of, you know, of just like little traumatic stress, and it feels like, you know, dis-ease, it feels like uncomfortable, it feels like you want to get up and run away, or maybe do the opposite and just like hide yourself from the world. And so what happens often is that we get stuck in one of the places. We get stuck in fear, or we get stuck in confusion and get weighed down by that confusion. We can get stuck in grief. We can get stuck in denial, and then we don't move from that one little place. Whereas the animal, cycling it through, almost like he was out there killed on the savannah, and then is reborn. And that's a cycle of going all the way through. Does it feel good? No. A lot of times it doesn't, but it feels great after you come out of it. And I think that in some ways can be really similar to sitting with medicine. That discomfort, and that it's not for nothing. I mean, I don't know if you guys have heard this before, but we've often talked about suffering clearing the way, and like the suffering being exactly what you need. And so it can kind of clear the way for the good stuff to come through you. And so your body and your psyche need to go through those emotions. They need to feel with them. They need to sit with them in order to release them, And sometimes we can't do that by ourselves. A lot of times, I would say we cannot do that by ourselves. We need our community members. We need people around us to be in support, because just that connection, as we saw with June's amazing experiential talk, that connection drives us. That's why we're here. And so we're all these vibrational, electrical beings, and we're reading off of each other. And so when we're reading off of each other, then it's also helping us to regulate our emotions. And when we're reading off of each other, then we're reading our environments better, and we're reading our systems better and more accurately. Lawrence, I know you had something.
You're okay. I was really appreciating that. And I'm going to kind of tie some stuff together because I've realized that I get super anxious when I'm sitting or doing something, and then I have an idea of like, oh, I want to go do something else. And then I don't do something else. And I get anxious. Like this morning when we were sitting having, breakfast, all of a sudden I was anxious, and I was like, I feel like leaving.
And your mind had already walked down the street.
And my mind
and your
was
body
left
was
2 or
like,
3 minutes ago.
I gotta catch up.
And so I guess I'll ask for your support in the future if you see me doing that. Me a little emotional hygiene, but my succinct and old school way of thinking about emotional hygiene is probably a saying in many, cultures around the world, is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Like, if you can brush your teeth and take care of your mouth, which, by the way, not a dentist, but it is correlated to every other system in your body. So if you take care of your mouth, your rest of your body will be healthy. But that's kind of how I look at it, kind of like changing the oil in a car, doing things, maintenance. I find when people don't do that, things break down, just like they would in any other situation.
They do.
So that's
They
my interpretation
do,
of emotional
and
hygiene.
I mean, a lot of therapists and social workers really love prevention work, and I love it when people are like about to go into crisis but not there yet, and then reach out for support, because I'm like, great, we can catch a snowball at the top of the hill. It doesn't have to like plow us down when it gets so big at the bottom of the hill that we can't catch it. We go to catch it and it just mows us down, and so I love that. And people will call and be like, well, like, I don't know if I should have called because like I'm not in crisis yet. And I'm like, yeah, I'm glad you called, because like that makes my job easier. If I get to have a conversation with you rather than like meeting with you in like jail, like it's so much easier. Like, I don't want to go to the jail either. I know you don't want to go to the jail, but like, let's talk on the phone, And to add on to that, so many people I see who've like totally gone into full crisis mode, and I am seeing them in a jail or hospital or like handcuffed somewhere. Like, I can't tell you how many times they're like, well, we didn't eat anything today, and like, didn't get any sleep, and it's like, okay, yeah. Like, you should have had a snack sooner. Like, now you're gonna be on probation for 3 years, Like, okay. And it's so true. We forget those like little things are truly the backbone, whether it's someone who's like really seemingly well put together and successful, or it's someone who's like, you know, has a lot of stuff that they're going through. It's so important to have the foundation of like the diet, the body, to have adequate sleep. You know, research shows that for people who experience what we call psychotic symptoms, and, you know, we'll say that like in a lot of that, you know, people here who are experiencing some forms of psychosis, which is basically seeing and hearing other things that other people don't, are, you know, could very well be untrained medicine people. And that's really scary, you know, and that's would be really heartbreaking, right, to be in that position without any like guidance or support or like love, acceptance, validity. Honoring our intuitional validity is so important. And sometimes that says like, I need more support and I can't do this by myself. It doesn't mean that like, it doesn't mean that you know every answer. You do, but sometimes you need some help to kind of fish that out, and to be there with you while you figure out what that is. Yeah, and so, but research shows that folks who are exercise, sleep, and nutrition are like the backbone for mental health. And probably a good time to pull out this little triangle where I put body on the bottom because it's really the foundation. You know, our bodies are the foundation. And that's also the starting point for when we work with medicine. The physical body is often a starting point for us, and it's the starting point where like the medicine comes in and starts its work, you know, because it all comes from the body. The next level here is the emotions. What are emotions? What even are they? Yeah. I mean, for me, emotions are intelligence. You know, there are a lot of different things, but they're intelligence for your psyche and for your body. They're telling you something. And some emotions get a bad rap, you know, but like emotions like anger can be so useful. That anger is telling you something needs to change. It's there for a reason. It's also a secondary emotion, which means there's always something underneath that anger. Anger is never the root emotion. And I think if you want a little bit more to dive deeper into the emotional stuff, just go online and Google like the emotions wheel, because it's incredible. All of our emotions stem out of 6 primary emotions, and then there's like 100. So I think it's easy for us to be like, I feel bad, you know, or like, I am angry. And I think that like investigating that and what is underneath of that is so important. Yeah, Stephanie.
How do you feel about in today's medicine, psychology, the psychiatry, where you are feeling emotions and they just want to put you on pharmaceuticals that make you not feel emotions?
I hate it because that's the opposite. So I shouldn't just say I hate it, because I think that like sometimes medicine is sometimes pharmaceuticals are necessary, and so I would never stand up here and say like go off all your psychotropic medicine, you know. That would be really insane and risky. However, I will say that the work that we do with the medicine here, it does the opposite of what those medications do. And I think that's really interesting in and of itself, because not just ayahuasca, but plenty of things connect your brain, okay, and light up all these different parts of your brain, and they get to talk to each other, you know, and they get to communicate. And for me, that feels like healing. You know, for me, that feels like processing. And so it's really interesting. A lot of like SSRIs, antidepressants, they shut down that center in your brain. And so that's also why it's really dangerous if you're on one of those medications to not mix it with the plant medicine, because it's got an MAOI in it, and that can be dangerous. And from a very informed, educated place, you should be talking to people about it and making the best decision for you. Because, you know, there's a syndrome called serotonin syndrome, and it's, you know, it can be fatal. It's not just a little thing, and that's basically where your brain has not made serotonin for a while, made much of it, and then it just pushes a ton out into your brain. And then it's so powerful that you get physically, you know, you get physically sick. What? So when you combine those two things, yeah, that's the danger. That can be a danger point. And some people are on those medications and choose to have plant medicine, and then they often need like because of that. Yeah. You want to jump in?
I was just taking the microphone
okay.
back and giving
Okay.
it to the next person. So
Yeah.
when people want to ask a question, it would be lovely if you would take the mic so we get a good
And to talk softly, I'm sure, because no one wants to blow out Zach's eardrums.
Like, I can't hear that.
Fair enough. So I'm curious,
Yeah.
and maybe you're going to get to this, Caitlin, but I'm
Yeah.
curious about sometimes, to go back to our mouths, Lawrence, you have a cavity
Yeah.
and you don't know it. Like,
Right,
or you've got
it's so
halitosis
true.
and everyone's like
Yeah.
smiling at you and they're
Yeah.
like their nose hairs
Yeah.
are burning.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like, and especially when you talk about emotions as intelligence, and how you develop a strategy, what I'm hearing you say,
Yeah.
movement and doing these self-care strategies, but what do you do
Yeah.
if you stink
Yeah.
before you get your bath?
Yeah. Well, I think that is a great question, because I think that's part of like what I would hope for emotional hygiene stuff is that we're checking in on a regular basis. You know, whether or not we've had a trauma, whether or not we've just come back from war, we've had a loved one pass and are struggling with all those grief emotions. It's that like we're doing those check-ins with people on a regular basis because we're human. You know, and we need that connection. And I think that oftentimes the power of talking to people, you know, another, you know, research thing that tells us actually about medication is that talk therapy and exercise are almost more effective than antidepressants, you know? So they're at least as effective. And so I would even phrase that as, it wasn't what the study was about, but as talking to a trusted person, you know? Let's give that to Sam, because is talking to a trusted person. And so the beauty of the reflection, which we've talked about a few times, the beauty of the reflection is that you can be that reflection for someone, and then when they see that reflection, and you may just hear yourself kind of repeating what they said to you, that's that's a reflection. Or maybe you just paraphrase it in your own words. It seems silly almost, but it's so powerful for people to hear, because they can see it. Their internal compass and their emotional well-being is being honored and held up as a reflection. And often, like, that's what people need in order to get that insight into, like, oh my God, my teeth are rotting out. You know, is to like have that reflection, right? And so I would say we all need to be checking in regardless of like our trauma history, just because we're humans and we need that connection, and we need that to help us regulate, you know? And we need that reflection and the people around us to help us self-regulate and be reading our environments, you know?
Check. No, maybe. My question was maybe little bit technical for where you're at, but methamphetamine in the
Yeah.
West, the Southwest, pretty bad.
So bad.
It's alarming how much of it there is.
Yeah.
It's just everywhere.
Yeah.
Have you found anything specific that works for people who are, tending towards that stuff? I've being in construction, you'll see guys who are like, oh, I can work better on when I'm tweaking, and
Yeah,
they'll be up for
yeah.
3 days straight working, and what that does
Yeah.
to the adrenal glands, and
Oh, gosh, yeah.
I understand it messes with the fungal content of the gut, and then by that time
yeah.
you're not getting serotonin, you're getting
Right.
fungus, residue, whatever, to the brain.
Yeah.
And it's just alarming how quickly that seems to destroy the body. Teeth falling out, like you said, it's all connected. Have you found anything specific for people who are attracted to that upper? I mean, that's always been my drug of choice,
Yeah.
uppers.
Yeah.
You got the Adderall, which is
Yeah.
pumped to kids
Right.
like crazy.
Yeah.
Replacing what gives your body energy naturally to do things without getting into that world. Have you
Yeah.
found anything that works
I
well?
think that's a great question because I know I see that so much and it breaks my heart, and so I guess it depends on where the person is at. For people who are just sort of drifting into that stuff, I really try to impress upon them that they don't need a chemical substance in their body to make them feel a certain way, that they can get there naturally too, or to a better place naturally. And so often I think for people who are especially lacking energy and want that energy, things like breath of fire. Have you heard of breath of fire? It's like a breathing exercise where you're increasing your energy. That can be really effective. And also just a conversation too of, we don't get anything for free. If you take a chemical substance and you can work really well for 3 days, well, it's gonna take more than 3 days from you. There's a price for that, and you pay that price. And I think a lot of people can kind of resonate with that because even if you're not on a chemical substance, we've all been burnt out, right? And right now, burnout is huge. We're all burned out in some ways, and it's about how do I re-engage after burnout? We can talk a lot about burnout, but are we talking about how to re-engage after that? And what do we use to do that? I think that also, I think back to the experiment they did with 2 sets of rats, and some of you might know this, it's a pretty famous one, where one cage had a really bleak, dismal, dark, uninteresting environment. And the other habitat had all the toys and all the food and was bright and sunny and all these things to do. And they put cocaine in both the crates in their water, both had it as an option along with the water. And the rats in the fun, healthy environment tried it once and didn't go back to it because they had other stuff to supplement. And so the rats in the dismal crate with nothing all drank it until they died. And so we're products of our environments. It's set and setting. What feeds us becomes us, and also what are we replacing things with? We come to things like this and we release, and then what are we filling up on? Do you want me to?
So some of the things that we've been talking about with the ayahuasca community, specific tools for that.
Yeah.
We've got body, we've got emotions.
Yeah.
What comes next on that diagram?
So next, anybody want to take a guess? I put here mental, because this part of it is where we make sense of our emotions, where we make sense of what's going on in our body, how we put the story together, Yeah, how we frame things, this is how our brain makes sense of it. And it's so important to remember that emotion, thought, action are all linked. And you can go in and you can try to change one of those things by changing one of them. You can change all of them by changing one of them, And some of that is just the awareness of wow, I had this interaction with the person and I felt like a kid again. like with my mom yelling at me, you know, and just that awareness sometimes is enough. Just the way that we make a mental connection is enough to kind of snap us out of it and say, like, this person is not my mom. And that really goes back to the hippocampus too, because when we store trauma in the hippocampus, in the center of our brain, it's, for the most part, when it's hanging out there, it's unknown to us. And so say I was abused as a kid by my babysitter and she had red curly hair, okay, and that's a really distinct memory and trauma that like I haven't processed. And then I go into the grocery store and I go to pay the cashier and she has red curly hair and kind of looks like her. My brain doesn't say like, I don't like this lady because she reminds me of my abusive babysitter I had when I was 7. My brain says she's a bitch. That's how the process. Trauma does not come back to us as, you're having this emotion because it's linked to this, and this is the way you felt then, and so, no. It comes back as like oftentimes a physical response, comes back as a reaction, you know? When we react, we're back in that limbic brain. When we respond, we're moving more into the front of our brain, you know? And so just with that awareness and knowledge of like, who does this person remind me of is enough to kind of like get into that, put a wedge in that destructive cycle where you're in reaction, you're in fear, and brings you more into the conscious, into a conscious place. Yeah.
So, talking about the toolkit, right?
Yeah.
You're defining out the different levels, and then, so
Yeah.
for the body, if I got it right, then you're saying that the tool you want for your body is getting proper rest, nutrition, and exercise, right?
Mm-hmm. Lots of water, yoga.
Right, and then the yoga also gets into the emotional level because whatever we're carrying in our body then is released and
Yeah.
balanced,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then with the emotions, there was the awareness you said, right? That's the toolkit.
Like the intelligence,
Yeah.
right?
Oh,
What is it
because of
telling me?
intelligence,
Yeah.
right? Paying
Yeah.
attention to it
Yeah.
because it's your intelligence.
Yeah.
And the connection between heart and
Yeah.
mind, right? And gut, probably.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Then mental, you're saying that to be aware of what triggers us, that it probably goes back to something else,
Yeah.
really?
The mental is the thinking mind. It's so powerful. The thinking mind is so powerful. It's how we make sense of things, how we read our environment. It's the stories that we tell ourselves, you know? And I think that like the cognitive reframe is something we can talk about, is saying like, you know, if I lock my keys out of my car, I might be tempted to say like, I'm so stupid, you know? Like, I always mess up. I always forget things. I'm so absent-minded. Instead of saying like, I made a mistake, I'm learning, you know? Or like, I had a stressful morning and I had a lot on my mind, and that's why I made a mistake, because I have all this other stuff going on. You know, and so the cognitive reframe is all about recognizing the story that you're telling yourself and then reframing some of that for yourself. I often think like when I'm judging myself and being really critical to myself, I think, would I say that to my best friend? Would I say that to a loved one? Would I come down that hard on them? No. The answer is almost always no, I would not. You know, and so it's about just recognizing the stories that you're telling yourself, and then having, a lot of us are very wise, but if we don't have the kindness to go along with that wisdom, then it's really wounding and can be violent almost. If you just have the wisdom, but you don't have the loving kindness, compassion to couple that and to support that, it can be, you know, it can be really traumatizing.
Okay, so
Yeah.
what's in the top triangle?
So the top
I can't help
is
but be
spiritual.
curious.
The top is spiritual stuff. And, you know, I think things like, you know, things can fit into different categories. Like yoga, you know, probably fits into all these. You know, it can be different for everyone. And I think like, when I think of looking at like this, often we're visualizing sort of wisdom or intelligence or cosmic intelligence kind of coming in through our crown, you know, and yeah. Mindfulness for I think mindfulness is, it's key, you know.
Going back to that question, pain to them is normal.
Yes. Everything is normal. You get used to everything, and you get comfortable, and it's about breaking that comfort, you know, and stepping outside of your comfort zone. And I think that, you know, talking about things, coming together in community to do this work, medicine, ceremony, are all things that we can do to shift our perception. What people really, you know, strive after is a perception shift. Courtney talks about the rice paper walls, and I love that analogy because it's true. We need these forts in our mind where we're stuck, you know, when really it's a rice paper wall that we can move, change just a little bit, and open up the whole room, you know? And so I think that, mindfulness is absolutely key, probably in all the things we talked about, you know, with compassion. It's not, that is so important. And I think that, so often we visualize things kind of coming through our crown, and the way that I think of the chakras in some sense is like, there's like, and then the heart space, which we've been talking about today too, and I love so much. Space is what we give out into humanity. You know, that's what we give out. And then things down here are physical, material, earthly realms, you know, the further down you go. But that heart space is moving out into humanity. And so what I think is nice about this is that even though I have, you know, we have the body on the bottom because foundation for us in this earthly realm, this is our vessel. So it is, you know, it's our foundation, but it's not a linear thing. You don't have to like necessarily just start here. I would say you can start in any one of these where you feel most comfortable, because if you go in here, if you're most comfortable in spirituality and spirit, you can enter here and be doing that work, and it's going to affect all the other realms. Does that make sense? So they all, like we were talking about before, you know, if you're more comfortable state of making sense things, of writing, of talking, being an external process with people, then start there. And then the other realms are going to be affected by that. You're going to be moving those as well, you know? And so part of that is just like being in a space that you love. And that's going to have a really positive effect on you and the people around you. You know, I think that like when we start with the body, we have a lot of somatic markers for what's going on with us. We have pain. We feel restless, or we feel really happy and settled in our body, but we have all these somatic markers we can look back. We have physical sense, and our job is kind of, what is this physical sensation telling me? You know, you have the like emotional intelligence, and then you have the mental of like labeling it, making sense of it, you know, defining it, and then reframing it. All this stuff is dynamic. It's not static. It's changing. It's always changing, you know. When people are really worried about like a mental health diagnosis, it's like they change. The DSM, which we use to get people's like diagnoses out of, which I think is a whole other thing where we're pathologizing people essentially, but it's just a way of looking at the human experience, really. We're all in all of these places at some point, you know. It's just a way of understanding. It can be a way of understanding the human experience. I think that like when we move transitions, I think, and it's so vital to honor transitions. It's so vital. And so that can feel really hard. An example of a transition, yeah. Okay. An example of a transition is like saying goodbye, You know, how many of us know what an Irish goodbye is? I know I do, you know? Yeah, like you're at the party, I'm not around and give out the back door. I'm sure there's like many different ways of labeling that, but it's so important to have those conversations and those moments with people even when they're uncomfortable, and it's important not to sugarcoat it or call it something else. It's really like tempting to want to be like, oh, I know we're saying goodbye, but I'll see you again, and like we'll get together again. And no, honor the and ending, then honor that and be with that and name that. It's so important that you're doing that with your transitions and honoring that and being with people in that, you know, and it's important so that we're not getting stuck in those places. So I would say that one thing I'll just touch on briefly is like stuckness and disassociation is a big trauma place. And so like we could talk for hours about trauma and like all the different places you can get stuck. But I think that so many of us, like, we dissociate a little, which means we kind of like step outside of our bodies and we're just not really present, you know. We freeze. That can look like scrolling online for 3 hours and you don't even realize it. I think of that as a trauma response, you know. And so I think that's a really big one. Human relationships, we're always gonna rupture, you know, and it's really about the repairing. So it's not about trying to keep it from rupturing, it's about how do we repair it when it does, you know, and like, what does that mean for you? I think ultimately we all have our own unique like roadmap for what emotion for every single person. For me, it's being in nature and eating healthy food, it's yoga, it's meditation, it's talking with people, but for everyone it's something different, you know? Yeah. So I think that basically we come to all these things and then it's the integration, you know? We integrate as a community, we learn something, and then we take a while to integrate it. We don't just learn it and then go out and do it necessarily. We've got to integrate that. Yeah. You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you. And I will just say, we always need something to hope for. And like that spiritual hope, it's not like a toxic positivity thing, it's authenticity. You know, what are you hoping for? The best thing you can do in life is to find out what you're hoping for, what you're yearning toward, and go, you know. Well, thank you guys so much for letting me